I told my dying father he was a failure. I spat those words into the quiet room where only the beeping of a heart monitor and the faint smell of antiseptic answered back. I wish I could say I was young and foolish, but I was 56, old enough to know better, old enough to understand the gravity of parting words, and yet bitterness and disappointment twisted my voice into a weapon. And 5 years later, a stranger would come to me with something that turned my world upside down.
My name is Daniel Walsh. I'm 61 now. I live alone in a modest apartment in Sacramento. I have stage 4 lung cancer. No wife, no children. Just a hospice nurse who visits daily and the haunting echoes of a past I can't change.
My father's name was Albert. He worked as a janitor for 42 years in the same elementary school I once attended. Every night he came home smelling like disinfectant and exhaustion with holes in his shoes, but a smile on his face. I hated that smile. I saw it as delusion, a man content with nothing. As a child, I didn't understand poverty, but I understood shame. I envied kids whose fathers wore suits and carried briefcases, not mops. I remember once begging him not to come to school functions. He nodded, heartbroken. I didn't care. All I wanted was to forget him. I left home at 18, vowing to be everything he wasn't. I became a regional sales manager in a mid-sized tech firm, made decent money, drove a nice car, but no matter how far I rose, I never invited my father to see it. In my eyes, he didn't belong in that world. When he fell ill, the doctor said he didn't have long. Pancreatic cancer, terminal. I flew out of guilt, not love. The hospital was dim, the sheets too white, his face too pale. His voice was soft. He tried to ask how I was. I snapped. You wasted your whole life sweeping floors. What do you have to show for it? Nothing. You're a failure, Dad, and that's all I'll remember. He didn't speak again. He just looked at me, eyes filled with a kind of sorrow I still can't describe. He died the next morning. I wasn't there. At the funeral, my siblings avoided me. My younger sister wouldn't look me in the eye. My brother called me a disgrace. I deserved it. But I didn't care. I buried him with anger still alive in me, as if it were my last weapon of control. For years after, I never spoke about him. Not to anyone. I kept moving until the illness slowed me down, until the silence started screaming. And then 5 years later, a knock at my door would begin to unmake everything I thought I knew about the man I had condemned. The years after my father's death weren't kind, not that I expected them to be. I carried my bitterness like a badge, but guilt crept in slowly like fog seeping through the cracks. It began with sleepless nights, then dreams, then silence. My career dwindled with age. The company let me go during downsizing. I had enough savings to survive, but the calls stopped coming. Friends faded. I was too proud to admit I needed anyone. That's when the coughing started. Persistent, dry, then bloody. I ignored it until I couldn't. The diagnosis came fast. Lung cancer advanced. I had never smoked a day in my life, but life is rarely fair. The doctor said I might have a year if I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky. I felt exposed. I moved into a smaller place, sold my car, canceled everything except the nurse visits. I couldn't even remember the last time I smiled genuinely. Each morning I woke with pain, not just in my chest, but in my soul. The memory of that hospital room haunted me. I replayed the moment I called my father a failure, sometimes imagining he said something back, anything, but he hadn't. That silence, that awful wounded silence, echoed louder with every passing day. Then, on a rainy afternoon, I decided to go through the old storage box I'd shoved in my closet years ago. It was mostly junk tax returns, photographs, faded birthday cards. But at the bottom, I found something strange. A worn, leather-bound trunk with my father's initials, A.W. Inside were books, dozens of them, handwritten journals neatly stacked, notes, sketches. At first I thought they were old accounting logs. But no, they were stories. Fictional stories. Fantastical, full of emotion, character, struggle, and triumph. Thousands of pages, all written by him. I was stunned. My father wrote. I scanned through one of the journals. The handwriting was tight, precise. The title read, The Custodian's Kingdom. The main character was a janitor who lived two lives. By day, he mopped floors in an elementary school. By night, he became the protector of a magical realm hidden within the walls of the school. It was brilliant, complex, moving.
Why didn't he tell me?
I sat on the floor reading page after page until I coughed blood onto the cover. My nurse had to help me back to bed, but the question gnawed at me. Why keep this secret? Why never publish, never share? The next morning I made a call to my sister. She answered coldly. I told her about the journals. Her voice cracked.
You didn't know, she asked. Dad wrote every night. He submitted stories for years, got rejected dozens of times. But he kept writing, for us, for himself.
I hung up overwhelmed. That was the first crack in the armor I had worn for decades. But the truth, his truth, was still incomplete. And soon, someone unexpected would come to finish the story. A week passed and I couldn't get the journals out of my mind. I kept them beside my bed like sacred text. Sometimes I'd hold one to my chest as if I could absorb the pieces of him I had so cruelly discarded. The nurse noticed. She asked who A.W. was. I told her. Her eyes softened. She said, "You talk about him in your sleep." Then came the day that changed everything again. It was early evening. The air smelled like impending rain. I was dozing in my chair when the doorbell rang, a sound so rare now that it startled me. I shuffled to the door and opened it. Standing there was a tall man in his 30s, tan trench coat, short beard, a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. He looked nervous, but spoke clearly. "Mr. Walsh, Daniel Walsh." "Yes."
My name is Owen Roth. I knew your father.
The words took a moment to register. "You must be mistaken," I replied hoarsely. "My father died 5 years ago."
I know. That's why I'm here.
He asked if he could come in. I hesitated, then nodded. We sat in the small living room, sunlight fading against the blinds. He opened his satchel and pulled out one of my father's journals. Not just any one, it was The Custodian's Kingdom, the same copy I had been reading. "I found this at a used bookshop in Portland," he said. "It had your father's name and return address inside. The shopkeeper told me the man who sold it said it belonged to a genius no one ever read." I read it in 2 days. I was speechless. "I'm a writer," he continued, "or I try to be. But your father's work, it changed me. It's why I teach literature now. He inspired me to start again, to write." He looked at me suddenly unsure. "I tracked you down because I felt like someone needed to know what your father left behind." I couldn't hold back. My voice cracked. I told him he was a failure. On his deathbed, I said he wasted his life.
Owen didn't flinch.
He didn't. He left a legacy. Not everyone gets to see their work live on, but it does. In me, in the students I share it with, in you. He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were printed pages, his effort to transcribe and preserve the stories. There was also a letter, my name written in careful script. "It was inside the back cover," Owen said. "I thought it belonged to you." My hands trembled. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. Not then. Owen stood up. "I know I'm a stranger, but to me your father was a mentor even if he never knew it. Thank you for letting me in." He left quietly, and I sat in the dark, holding the letter like it was my last chance at forgiveness. I couldn't sleep that night. The letter sat on my nightstand untouched, humming with quiet weight. Every time I looked at it, I felt like it might burst into flame, as if it carried the judgment I had earned and now feared. Morning light crept through the blinds. I sat up coughing into a tissue that bloomed red. I was dying, and yet it was the letter that scared me most. Eventually, I slid it into a drawer and tried to forget. But the universe had other plans. 2 days later, Owen returned with students. 3 of them. College-age, polite, nervous. Each one carried a different journal of my father's. One girl said she had read The Custodian's Kingdom 3 times. Another mentioned a story where a janitor defeats an invisible beast that feeds on children's fears. The metaphors, he said, they hit hard. I sat quietly stunned. These kids spoke about my father with reverence. My father, the man I belittled and abandoned. They asked if I had more of his work. I pointed to the box near the bookshelf. They eagerly knelt down, gently lifting each one like a sacred relic. One of them, a young man with long hair and a black hoodie, turned to me. He didn't write for fame, did he? He wrote for something deeper. I nodded, barely whispering. He wrote for all the things I never saw in him. As they copied and scanned the journals into their laptops, Owen explained he had started an online archive. The custodian's voice, he called it. A digital library dedicated to janitors, custodians, cleaners, anyone whose voices had been muted by society. At the heart of it all, my father's stories. They asked if I wanted to contribute a foreword. I almost laughed. What could I possibly say, but Owen gently insisted, "You're part of this legacy too." When they left, they took copies with them but left the letter, still sealed. Later that evening, I sat alone again. The apartment felt smaller, colder. I poured tea with shaky hands. My reflection in the dark TV screen looked like a stranger, and then I opened the drawer. I slid the letter out, peeled back the edge. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed and thin. Written in his unmistakable hand, "Danny, I know you see me as small. I don't blame you. The world taught you that success is loud and visible, but I found peace in silence. Stories gave me that. You gave me that, the dream of you reading them one day. If you're reading this now, maybe you're ready. If not, that's okay. I still love you. Always, Dad."
I wept. Deep, shuddering sobs that cracked something I didn't know still lived in me.
I was 61 terminal, and for the first time, I saw my father. Not the janitor, the giant. After reading the letter, something inside me shifted like a glacier cracking after centuries of silence. I wasn't just grieving my father. I was grieving the version of him I had refused to see, the decades lost to judgment, pride, and fear. His words weren't just a goodbye, they were an invitation, and I had nearly missed it. That night, I pulled out one of the thicker journals, Dust and Starlight. It was different from the others, more personal, less fantasy. It told the story of a man who cleaned a school by day, but at night sat on the rooftop and watched stars alone, naming constellations he made up himself. Each star had a name: Daniel, Clara. Jack, our names, his children. We had been his universe. I read until morning. The next week, Owen invited me to a reading event at the university. At first, I declined. Too sick, I said, too tired, but he gently insisted again. It's not about a speech, just your presence. Your father's stories are starting to find their audience. So I agreed. They picked me up in a small van with a ramp. The students helped me into a wheelchair. I felt fragile, out of place, like an old man at a stranger's birthday party. But then I saw the auditorium. It wasn't massive, but it was full. Full of people, young and old, holding printed zines of my father's stories, wearing pins that said AW Lives. One corner held framed pages of his handwritten manuscripts. Another displayed his mop and janitor badge in a glass case. I sat at the side, overwhelmed. Then the event began.
One by one, students came up and read excerpts from his work. They didn't just read, they performed. They felt every word, every joke, every pain. They brought his characters to life, his voice to life. One girl, maybe 17, read a line I remembered from The Custodian's Kingdom.
"Heroes aren't loud. They clean up after the loud ones." The room went still. I cried again. I didn't try to stop it this time. Then Owen walked up and introduced me. "This is Daniel Walsh, son of Albert Walsh. The writer, the dreamer. The man who taught us that even unseen hands can change the world." They clapped, not out of pity, out of respect. For him, for what he left behind. I was given the mic. My hands trembled as I spoke. I told my father he was a failure, on his deathbed, and I never got to take it back. But today, I see that I was wrong. He didn't fail. I did. I failed to see the greatness right in front of me. Silence, then applause. After the event, students came to thank me, not for speaking, but for sharing him, for giving them his stories.
That night, I didn't sleep from pain. I stayed up rereading his journals, this time with a heart ready to listen.
And I felt him there in the quiet, smiling. The days that followed were slower, quieter, but filled with a new kind of warmth. I wasn't afraid of dying anymore, not in the same way. I was still fading. Yes, the pain hadn't lessened. The nurse still changed my IV, still jotted quiet notes on her clipboard. But something had changed in me. I had made peace. Or at least, I was learning how to. Owen continued visiting. He brought more student letters, notes of thanks poems inspired by my father's writing, even a short graphic novel adaptation of Dust and Starlight. They treated his stories like treasures, his voice like scripture, and I finally allowed myself to be proud of him and of being his son.
One evening, as we sat near the window, I asked Owen, "Why do you think he never told me?"
He hesitated, then replied softly, "Maybe he did. Just not in the way you expected. Maybe he was always telling you in every story he wrote, in every character he created. You just weren't ready to hear it." I nodded. I knew he was right. I had spent decades chasing recognition, titles, raises. My father had spent his nights building worlds. I had dismissed him as small, but now I saw he was bigger than I'd ever been.
One story stayed with me more than the rest.
In it, the janitor meets a boy who hates him, mocking him, avoiding him, ashamed of him. But when the school is threatened by a shadow creature that feeds on broken families, the janitor saves the boy at a cost. In his final moments, he says, "I don't need you to love me now, just remember me right." I knew that boy had been me. The cancer spread to my bones. I lost weight rapidly, my body caving in. Hospice took over fully. My nurse Grace became more like family. On her shifts, she read Dad's stories aloud to me, sometimes even laughing through tears. When I had the strength, I asked her to record audio versions of them for the archive.
In my final week, Owen returned with something new. He held a thin paperback in his hands. On the cover, The Custodian's Kingdom, published independently under my father's name.
"We did it," he said. "We published his first book." I held it, fingers trembling. My eyes filled again. Inside the dedication read, "To Daniel,
For hearing him even when it was almost too late."
I passed that night, clutching the book to my chest, the window open, the stars above blinking faintly through the dark.
We don't always recognize the greatness in people until time has stolen the chance to tell them. My father lived a life of quiet, humble beauty while I chased noise and missed what mattered. If you're reading this or listening, know this: forgiveness isn't a moment, it's a process. And sometimes it starts with a single act of honesty.
Tell your loved ones what they mean to you. Share in their passions. Don't wait for a diagnosis or a funeral to acknowledge their worth, because we all leave something behind. And it's not the size of the spotlight that defines a legacy. It's the warmth it leaves in others long after we're gone. My father's voice lives on, in pages and hearts, and finally in mine.